This video will discuss 3 reasons why NASA et al. Will almost surely go back to the moon before they try any manned missions to Mars. The first 2 are reasonable, I suppose. The third reason, perhaps the real reason, is not. I will also add some thoughts about why Chinese military adventures on the moon are neither a real threat nor a good reason to get to the moon before the Chinese. The first reason to go back to the moon, rather than try for Mars, is that there is much more water on the moon than we realized back in the 1960s and 70s. This water can not only be used at the lunar research stations and similar facilities, but it can also be used to make rocket fuel. Making rocket fuel where you are located in space, rather than lifting such fuel from Earth, offers enormous cost savings and design efficiencies. The second reason is that it has come into the general consciousness that the infinite number of asteroid hits on the moon offers a cornucopia of metals and other riches. Rather than having to rely on the undifferentiated materials on the moon's surface for metals, humans can mine these asteroids for the stuff the moon itself does not offer. While some at NASA may have realized this during the Apollo era, it certainly was not a factor in deciding what could realistically be done on the moon. Information about the resources on the moon available from asteroid strikes has now entered the general consciousness, and we can plan to use the resources to ease the design and construction of facilities on the moon. The third reason for the moon, the bad one, is that going to the moon would be much cheaper than going to Mars. By going to the moon, governments on Earth could boast about how they are continuing the space efforts started in the 1970s, without spending the kinds of government dollars Martian colonies would require. The rhetoric about practicing for Mars and learning how to do things in space is just happy talk. We knew how to do things in space in the 1970s, and if we were not practicing for Mars, what exactly was the Space Shuttle program and the International Space Station all about? If you want to get humans to Mars, the only place in the solar system even remotely like Earth, you need to keep in mind Napoleon Bonaparte's message to his generals about getting sidetracked. If you want to take Vienna, take Vienna. The elaborate indirect plans that Napoleon's generals drew up to capture the Austrian capital were discarded in favor of the direct and ultimately successful approach of marching directly on that city. I will now discuss one other reason the US and other Western-style democracies might argue in favor of going to the moon and not Mars. This relates to an overwrought worry about China gaining some kind of a military edge if they do something on the dark side of the moon. This military excuse to get back to the moon must rest upon 2 assumptions, either one of which being invalid makes the back to the moon to stop China idea the wrong way to get back into space. The first is that the Chinese gain some significant military advantage by creating a few costly lunar facilities. A contrarian view is that it might actually be to the advantage of China's adversaries if the Chinese spend $1 trillion to create such facilities. Their real military would, by necessity, suffer from a shortage of funds, and I cannot now envision any significant advantage to be gained by staging nuclear weapons, troops, spy facilities, or other weapon systems on the moon. The Chinese, of course, already have spy satellite and anti-satellite weapons in low Earth orbit. Having soldiers in space or on the moon offers no military advantage that I can see. They have plenty of ways to deliver nuclear weapons without shooting them from the backside of the moon, where they can be easily detected on the long flight to Earth. There is no military advantage afforded the Chinese by getting to the moon. The second reason for this issue is that we must assume the Chinese are a threat to world peace. I am not sure how true this is today. I am much less sure about this being the case in the future. It seems obvious to the informed that keeping the status quo in Taiwan is much more important to the West than keeping that status quo in Ukraine. Moreover, with the election of Donald Trump, the Ukraine situation will surely be resolved long before any Chinese military bases are established on the moon. Our betters in Washington and London can give speeches saying that the Chinese are and will be an enemy state. But this enemy will need to overcome a whole rash of terribly significant problems before they would be in a position to disrupt the current world order. Among these are the government toppling issues of overwhelming debt, a lack of truly advanced technology, a world economy pulling away from China due to the COVID pandemic, a population decline unprecedented in world history, and, if the Chinese attack Taiwan, sanctions from nearly every advanced nation in the world that will surely destroy an economy built on exports. Another reason not to view China as a threat to world peace is that the Chinese have not been an expansionist power for many centuries. They believe that historic Chinese territory should be Chinese, but they are not likely to invade Vietnam, Korea, Mongolia, etc., to annex land that has never been Chinese. I leave off on this now. If you disagree with my China analysis, please explain in the comments. Recent statements by high-ranking NASA officials about China have been used to justify an early return to the moon. Their idea goes like this. If China gets to the moon first, they might be about to restrict access to places others on Earth may like to study or explore. Neither do I find these ideas credible for reasons I lay out here. First, the moon has a very large surface area. It does not seem possible that the Chinese could restrict in any meaningful way access to a significant part of the moon's vast terrain. Second, in order to restrict access to areas the Chinese consider their own, despite their obligations under the Outer Space Treaty, it would seem they would need to use force, most likely deadly force, to achieve this end. I doubt that China would risk a world war to prevent a few Westerners from looking at moon rocks. Third, since science has certainly become an international enterprise, and since, by necessity, the majority of Chinese at a Chinese moon base would be scientists and engineers, I do not believe these people would have any interest at all in stopping fellow scientists and engineers from exploring interesting aspects of the moon or even sharing information about what they and these others have discovered in their explorations. China is an authoritarian state and, as such, could station soldiers at the moon base with orders to keep foreigners out. The Chinese scientists and engineers at the moon base would have little choice but to stand aside and let things play out. However, for the reasons I have stated here, I think the likelihood that such dramatic and potentially disastrous events would occur for such minimal return are minimal at best. In any event, since it is Mars that humans should be looking at, Chinese activity on the moon would seem to be irrelevant. I have laid out my thoughts in these 3 videos about the moon and why it is a vastly inferior stop on our itinerary in space. Even if the Chinese get to the moon and even if they take steps to restrict access to places other nations would like to investigate, hotels, lunar factories, refueling facilities, etc., will all happen on the moon if the mission to Mars achieves its goals. I may or may not have convinced you that Mars is a better destination than the moon for our next adventure in space, and that this is why I am proposing a mission to Mars, and not a mission back to the moon. I hope that most people who are truly interested in traveling to another celestial body will do enough research to come to a similar conclusion. I do not have all the answers, and my opinions are not the last word, never to be amended with better information and better logic. It seems to me, however, that the current pros and cons of the Mars-Moon issue swing very strongly in the direction of Mars, and that most people with open minds and armed with similar amounts of information will necessarily come to the same conclusion. I have outlined in these 3 Why Not Moon videos the reasons that going to Mars will ultimately be much more beneficial to humanity than doing a bypass program to go back to the moon. I welcome comments, as I am sure I have omitted something that might merit discussion. Based on the information we now have, though, we should not go back to the moon, especially if the goal is to get to a place where humans can live very close to the way they do on Earth. To paraphrase Napoleon, if you want to go to Mars, go to Mars.